We're now going to take a look at creating different sets of texture maps for single materials of ecosystem vegetation, and we're going to be using the eco-material variance. So with just a terrain in the scene, I'm going to edit the material and add an ecosystem. And we're going to add a plant. And what I'm going to select, I'm going to go ahead and use the rural maple tree. And we can populate it and take a look at the density. And that looks like it should be good. What we need to do is establish the other materials we'd like to have available, or the other texture maps. If we take a look, the maple leaf or the maple tree only has one material for all of the leaves, and we edit the function, we see our color map. So what we want to do is mix and pick different sets of color maps and transparency maps to move through the ecosystem and be replaced on different trees. So we need to have another material we can use, and using the view species, I'm going to load in another or two more plants. We'll use the plum tree, and what we're basically going to be doing is just taking the textures out of these trees and inserting them into the maple tree. And then we're going to select another, and we'll go ahead and use the alder. So in order to get the materials or the texture maps, because a lot of these are incorporated into the vegetation themselves, there's no actual link, and a lot of them are locked in too. So what we need to do is just copy and paste them from the functions. So let's start with the plum leaf, and we're going to edit the material, edit the function, and we can select the transparency and the color map. I'm going to hit Control-C on the keyboard to copy it. As you can see up at the top, the copy commands are grayed out, but if you Control-C to copy, you should be able to copy them over. And then we can go into the maple leaf, edit the material, and just move these out of the way, and we can paste in the other materials. Now, because if these aren't connected to anything, they'll probably get deleted from the function once we close it out. So let's go ahead and start setting up the variance. So this is a combiner node. You can go to MetaNodes and select eco-material variance. And it has 3 inputs on top. So what we can do is take color 1 and connect it to this projected texture map, the original maple, color 2 to the new texture we brought in. And we're going to connect the output to the color output of our variance. Now we still have one more available spot for a color, which we'll be loading in just after we connect these texture maps to make sure they don't get removed from the function. Now, as you can see, these are color maps, and what we need is a transparency map, numeric information. And in order to make sure everything gets passed through correctly, and now with the black and white transparency, you probably could just use the color information to get a good output, but once you start mixing bumps, and in this case we don't really have a change in the bump, but I'll go ahead and show you one of the dependent nodes. So we're going to go to Combiner, MetaNodes, and we're going to choose what we have are 2 different dependents. And you can see anytime we have a dependent in snowFlaKe, there are brackets in front of it just to let you know it is a dependent node. And what we're going to use is the numeric dependent. So this has 3 numeric inputs on top, and it also has a vector. So what we can do is connect this vector to the output vector of the first variance, and what it's going to do is pass that information from this top or first variance and match it within here, but give us the ability to control numbers. And this will not cut or clip out numbers outside of the range of 1 and -1. So you can go over, when you're working with bumps, you don't need to worry about working within a specific range. So now we can connect input 1 to the grayscale output, input 2 to the other map, grayscale output. Click OK, and we just need our last set of texture maps to load into this, because it does give us 3 options. Now if you did just want to use 2, you could connect the other output to just one of those texture maps again, just making sure they match. But we're going to go to the leaf tree natural material, which is for the alder tree. Copy, so highlighting them, copying them, click OK. And then we can go into our maple leaf. And it looks like it's not going to let me paste them right now. Go ahead and try that again. So View wasn't letting me copy and paste those 2 texture maps. They appear to be locked. So what I did was I grabbed the 2 textures from the material, and I created a MetaNode out of them. And then I went ahead and saved the MetaNode, and I just called it temp. And then I reloaded it in to this function and ungrouped it in order to get the 2 texture maps. I'll go ahead and load that back in. Okay, so now we're going to set them up in order, and we can connect our additional, or our last output. So now any changes we make within the eco material variance in the main, the top node, it's going to pass that information over to make sure that the Boolean subtraction is matching both the transparency and the color. In that way we don't have any maps out of place. Now if we were to have a bump channel as well that wasn't just a noise as it is in this case, if we had different texture maps, we could set up another dependent and then set up those maps to go to the output and still control them all with the top node. We have the ability to control how many variations there are, whether or not we want the variations to show up in groups, and then how dense those groups are. And then the rest of the controls, the wavelength, noise, switch levels, those are for kind of fine-tuning, but they're not always going to be needed. For the most part, you can pretty much leave those alone unless you want to do any special modifications to them. But you can usually get a pretty good blend just with the top 3 sliders. You can also randomize the output. And you can already see by randomizing it, it is switching through the different texture maps because it is returning a different output in this one location. So we can go ahead and click OK in order to update that and take a look at a render, and we should be able to see the maps on the different trees. We're not necessarily going to see an OpenGL preview of this, so you really won't know until you render it, and we'll go ahead and let that render out. So now when we take a look, we can clearly see the different texture maps showing throughout the ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and modify this, and there's another thing I want to note. If we edit the material and take a look, the overall color, it's a good idea to reset this color if you're using a material that has this changed, because the color correction is going to apply to every texture map differently. So that's just something to pay attention to. We can make additional changes, increase the variations, and let's go ahead and add a little the group density. And these texture maps are showing really bright for this scene, so I am also going to modify my gamma and make the input texture map gamma, actually not quite 2.2, we'll go ahead and set it to 1.8. And I'll go ahead and zoom in a little closer too so we can see the texture maps showing a lot better. Because if we're too far away, we really can't see them. I'm going to go back and increase the density of the ecosystem as well. So you can start to see the texture map changes a little better. Still a little far away. But with the grouping on and the density turned up, you can start to see the trees that are changing being closer to each other, those with similar texture maps. So that's a nice little control in order to be able to adjust kind of the spacing between the variations. Turning off the density controls will give a much more patchy and very random appearance. And you can see with the groups and the density, much more tight clusters of each of the different textures. So now this can be used with any ecosystem material, any material that's going to be part of an ecosystem. It's not restricted to just vegetation. That just happens to be what I'm showing it with. So this will work with any material.